In the paper that Fiona Hill and I wrote about the possibility that Russia might go rogue in its neighborhood, this was the question about Vladimir Putin's concern that the European Union is intruding on his turf. With the association agreements that were initialed with Moldova and Georgia last November, I think the Russians were pleased that the Ukrainians basically froze their process. But as we looked at this, the concern is that sometime in the spring, the Russians might take punitive actions against particularly Georgia and Moldova. And if Ukraine somehow gets back on the European track, Ukraine could also find itself in Mr. Putin's target site. And the problem that we have is there is not a lot of leverage that the United States has now to exercise over the Russians on this. And it reflects a couple of things. One is the deterioration in the US-Russia relationship from, say, 2.5 years ago. So it's a thinner relationship. We don't have much leverage to say, if you do A, then we might have to undercut you on B. But second, there's also just, I think, a huge imbalance in interests. For Russia and for Vladimir Putin, building Russian influence in the post-Soviet space is the #1 priority. It's important to his vision of Russia as a great power. It's important to his domestic views. Being tough in the neighborhood, having that influence is important with the constituency that he looks to for support at home. And he looks at the European Union and says, the European Union is challenging my customs union project, so I'm going to push back. Now, in the case of Ukraine, I actually think there is an area where we actually may have some leverage there. But it's leverage that is going to be maximized if we can somehow work with the Europeans. And it wouldn't be leverage used with the Russians. It would be leverage targeted at Kyiv. And the US government seems to begin to move in this direction a little bit. Yesterday, they announced that some Ukrainian visas had been revoked because the visa holders had had connections to use of force. There, I think, is more to be played here in terms of threatening sanctions, both visa sanctions and also financial sanctions against the group of people around President Yanukovych, that inner circle. Because if they begin to worry that they can't travel to the West, and here's where it's important to bring in the European Union. These are folks who vacation in Europe, their kids go to school in Europe, they have luxury residences in Europe, they want to be able to travel to Europe. And if somehow Washington and Europe can get together and put that pressure, you may begin to have an impact on events on the ground in Ukraine that could, A, discourage use of violence, but also B, and I think this is going to be very hard to do, but prod Mr. Yanukovych into a good faith effort to negotiate a political settlement with the opposition. But that's about leverage that we may have with Ukraine that, sadly, I don't think the Europeans and the Americans have much with Russia.